All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you guys can hear me. Sorry for the delay. How is everyone? How was your Christmas holiday? I hope everyone can hear me. If you can hear me, just put your hands up, just unmute yourselves. And I hope there's no background interference. Okay, so if you all can hear me, we can start the lesson, right? So today, what I wanted us to focus on was the last topic in biology, which is your nutrient cycle and the human influences on the environment. That's what we want to focus on. So if you remember, we once talked about the energy flow in the environment. When you were talking about your food chains, your food web. Yeah. So we want to continue with that topic. Okay. All right. So it says here the host isn't allowing us to unmute. Okay. So let me just try and fix that. Okay. So you guys should be able to unmute now. All right, so I hope everyone can see my screen that I'm sharing.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right, so these were the topics that we last focused on at the beginning, before we left, even during online lessons, right? We looked at your food chains and your food webs and the energy in your food webs and food chains and the pyramids as well. So mainly what I wanted us to focus on was the nutrient cycles, right? That is your carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. Those are the ones I want to focus on mainly today, right? Okay, let me just fix this. So these are the two cycles that we want to focus on today, right? Are we following? Right, so if we look at the nutrients, right? So carbon cycle, when you hear carbon, what are we mentioning? We want to know what is carbon and how is it utilized in the environment, right? So we know carbon is the main constituent in your living organisms, right? We know most of your hydrocarbons contain your carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So carbon is very important in your organic molecules, right? So as you can see there, there's a finite amount of each element on the planet, and as such, they need to be recycled in order to allow new organisms to be made and for the growth. So we need this nutrient. It's very important, right? This element of carbon, right? It takes place and it's also used in many reactions. For example, your combustion and your photosynthesis. Are we following? Right? So carbon is taken out of the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, right? As we know, through the use of photosynthesis, right? Your green plants are the ones that photosynthesize. Are we following? Right? So through photosynthesis, we are able to take the carbon in the atmosphere, right, in the form of carbon dioxide, and then fix it into the organic molecules that we'll be making in your process of photosynthesis. Are we following? Does that make sense so far? Right. If there are no questions,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
we can move on. Just hold on. Right. So let's move on to this part. So in the carbon cycle, it is passed on to the animals by feeding. So remember, from the first step, we use the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to fix it into the organic molecules. And then the plants, your animals, then feed on these plants, the organic molecules, right? And then they move on to the next step, right? So then, how is it returned to the atmosphere, right? So in your plants, they respire, they break down these organic molecules through the process of respiration. Are we following? So in the form, it is now released back into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, right? So the ones that respire, the ones that can now take that, the organic molecules and then break them down again into carbon dioxide and then release it back into the atmosphere. Does that make sense? Through the process of respiration. So before we move on, I actually want us to look at the process of photosynthesis. You guys also are expected to know your chemical equations for these processes. For example, your photosynthesis, you have your carbon dioxide plus your water in the presence of your sunlight, right? So I'll just write my light there to give me your C6H12O6, which is your glucose molecule, plus what? What do we get there? Oxygen. This is your photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis. Are we following? Right. So is this balanced? Who can tell me, is this balanced? If you're unable to unmute yourself, just feel free to write in the chat as well.
No, it's not balanced.
No, sir, it's not balanced.
So how do we balance it?
You put a 6 in front of CO2,
Yes, so put a 6 in
H2O, and O2.
and then
In front of H2O
and then where else?
and in front of O2.
O2, the oxygen. Is that balanced now? That's correct. So this is the process of photosynthesis, right? So this is the balanced chemical equation of photosynthesis, right? So you need to be you're expected to know this process by head, right? They do ask you the question to list or to give the chemical equation of photosynthesis as well as the word equation. If they ask you for the word equation, you're simply writing it in words. Carbon dioxide plus water to give you, in the presence of light, to give you your glucose plus your oxygen, right? So now we move on to your respiration. Who can give me the chemical equation for respiration? Who can give me the chemical equation for respiration? Any volunteers? Anyone?
The chemical equation is C6H12O6
C6H12O6
plus 6O2 or O2. That arrow to give you 6CO2
6CO2
plus 6H2O.
6H2O. Excellent. Right.
Yeah.
And plus energy, right?
Yeah.
This is respiration, so it releases energy. Right. So if you can see, if you notice, this is the opposite of photosynthesis. So if you know your photosynthesis equation, you know your equation for respiration. Because here, your reactants for respiration are literally the products of photosynthesis, if you can see that. They and they're the same. And then the products here are the same for the for the reactants here for your photosynthesis. So it's simply the opposite, the reverse of photosynthesis. That is your respiration. Are we following, guys? So you're expected to know these two equations in detail. Make sure you know the balanced chemical equations for your respiration and your photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, I said, it simply takes the carbon and fixes it into organic molecules, right? So another thing to note when you're fixing your carbon, usually the carbon dioxide in your air, this here, the carbon dioxide there is reduced to form your glucose here. Are we following? So the carbon dioxide here is reduced to form your glucose molecule. Let me just admit. Okay. right? So it's important to know that the carbon inside the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is reduced to form your glucose molecules, the organic molecules. So that's a very important point, right? Then if animals and plants die in conditions where decomposing microorganisms are not present, the carbon in their bodies can then be converted over millions of years under significant pressure into fossil fuels. Who can tell me what fossil fuels are? What are fossil fuels?
So,
Yes.
so isn't it your oils and your natural gas that you find
Yes, the
under?
oils and the natural gases. Yes, thank you, JJ. Right. So those are the oils, the natural gases like your methane, right? Those are examples of your fossil fuels. They're what we use to make or to for our cars, right? The petrol, we get them for our fossil fuels. We follow to power the thermal stations that we use to get our electricity. We use those fossil fuels, right? So these fossil fuels contain your hydrocarbon molecules. So if you remember from the organic chemistry lesson, we talked about how we obtain our petrols. What is this? The jet fuel. We get it from the fractional distillation of your hydrocarbons. Are we following? So this is another point that you can see that this carbon is very important, right? It has a cycle. We started from the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, went to the carbon in the organic molecules that plants, animals use, and now we're looking at the fossil fuels. So can you see the cycle there? So it's very important for us to see where the carbon is being used, what it's turning into or what it's converting into, right? So that is the carbon cycle that you need to remember, right? So if you talk about your fossil fuels can then be burnt to form your carbon dioxide and your water, right? So it's now going back into the atmosphere, right? So this process is known as combustion, right? The burning of something, that is combustion, right? So it's sometimes referred to as the oxidation of your organic molecules. Yes, JJ, is there a question?
So,
Yes.
so when you essentially like burn something, so like for example wood and things like that, the thing that's left over, it's generally most carbon. So
Yes, that black suit that you have there, it's carbon. Are we
Okay.
following?
It depends.
so
Mhm.
It really
Right.
depends.
Sorry? Was there another question there? Thought I heard someone speaking. Right. So if there are no other questions, you can now see that we're now returning the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that completes the cycle, right? So that material that wasn't able to decompose the other microorganisms, that is converted to your fossil fuels. Then those fossil fuels, we mine them and then we burn them to get your energy, right? So your carbon dioxide, the byproduct of that is then returned back into the atmosphere. Are we following? Right. So now we need to be able to explain the use of these carbon dioxide. I mean, the carbon. If we're using too much fossil fuels, this will contribute to an increase in carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere. And we know that if you have an increased carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere, that can lead to global warming, right? Who can explain to me how this leads to global warming? Yes, JJ?
so I have a question, sir.
Yes, what's the question?
So what's the term carbon footprint?
Carbon footprint is basically looking at how much carbon is in a particular material.
Oh,
Yeah. So if they're talking about, for example, if you look at a particular country and they ask you what is the carbon footprint of, let's say it's motoring industry, you're looking at how much carbon they're actually putting into the atmosphere, right? Or how much carbon they're putting into the environment. That's the carbon footprint. Does that make sense?
yes, sir.
Yeah. Right. So now I was asking who can tell me how increased carbon dioxide content leads to global warming? from our geo guys?
So you have to talk.
Who's writing on my boards?
So it's fine, sir.
Uh-huh.
Um, carbon dioxide is known as a greenhouse gas, meaning
Yes.
it's one of the gases that trap heat in the atmosphere of the Earth. So
Yes.
an increasing of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere means that more heat will be trapped. Yeah,
Exactly.
thus increasing the temperature of.
Excellent. Excellent. Right. So meaning, as she said there, if you have an increase in carbon dioxide, this is a heating gas. So the more carbon dioxide you have, the more heat it trapped, hence leading to the increase in your global temperatures. That's how global warming occurs. Right. Thank you, Rosta. Right. So now you also need to explain through your deforestation. Remember, us humans, the reason why we want to create more jobs and everything, we're taking more land. We want to be able to build more factories, right? But then that leads to mass deforestation, right? When you're removing those trees, you're removing the ones that can actually convert your carbon dioxide back into oxygen or remove the carbon dioxide from the air, therefore reducing that carbon dioxide content. Are we following? So if you remove those trees, you've got less trees that can photosynthesize and remove the carbon dioxide from the air. Yes, JJ?
So it would be better, sir, to just build in this up into the sky instead of like reclaiming more land, sir. Because then you
Sorry?
use more. So I'm saying, sir, it'll in the case of humans expanding, sir,
Yes.
for jobs and things like that, sir, it would be it would be more suitable to like build like into the skies, like build skyscrapers. Then we use less land.
Yes, that's very true. I think that's what the most of the ideas is like with
Yes.
your mega cities. They actually want to go up. That's why we have skyscrapers rather than building horizontally or laterally. It would be better to build upwards. That way, you take up less space.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so that's a very good observation. Right. So the whole trick there now, if you have mass deforestation, you're removing the amount of producers. If you remove your producers, you've got less photosynthesizers and therefore less plants that can take away carbon dioxide from your atmosphere. That leads to your global warming, right? So as you can see there, that's what I explained in this whole point. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that in many areas of the world, deforestation is taking place for land rather than for the trees themselves. As such, they are burnt down, releasing yet more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Are we following? So you need to recognize that point and make sure you know how this increases your global warming or your temperatures as a whole, the climate change that we like to emphasize, especially with what was being discussed at the GP40. Right. So that is your carbon cycle there as a summary. So if you can see, if we start from your carbon dioxide in the atmosphere there, our first point there, right? It's taken in by your producers, the plants, right? Which is used for photosynthesis to produce your carbohydrates or your other biological molecules, right? And then this acts as your food source. Are we following? For your animals or the humans as well, your decomposers, right? They use that and then they respire. When they respire, they release it back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, right? But then the other material that was not able to be decomposed or eaten up by the animals is then taken down and then fossilized. Are you following? Which creates your fossil fuels at the bottom. They're under a lot of heat and a lot of pressure, right? And then we use those fossil fuels to burn, to create more energy, that produce our electricity, right? And then when we do that, we combust the carbon, we burn the carbon, thereby releasing your carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Are we following? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Yes,
Right, so
sir.
if there are no questions, we can move on. These are your exam tips that you guys can go through. As you can see there, the carbon is taken out of the atmosphere by your photosynthesis. It's very important to remember that. It's passed on to the animals by decomposers by feeding. It is then returned by respiration, right? So remember, when you respire, you're burning your organic molecules back into carbon dioxide to release energy, right? By the decomposers as well. In addition, it is returned in increasing amounts by combustion of your fossil fuels, right? So you're burning your fuels to produce energy as well. That creates, or the byproduct of carbon dioxide, which is released into the atmosphere, right? So you need to be able to know the cycle on how you start from your carbon dioxide to get it into your, which is fixed into the organic molecules. Then the organic molecules can either be respired or broken down through your decomposers. And then that material that is not able to be decomposed, which is left for, which is not fed on, is then fossilized. And then we combust that after a few, over 1 million years, it is then turned into fossil fuels. And then we burn that fossil fuels to get our carbon dioxide and to produce energy. So you need to know those steps in detail for your carbon cycle, right? Then I won't really touch on this mainly because I mainly want to focus on the carbon and the nitrogen cycle, but you guys are expected to know the cycle. I'm not too sure. If you look in your syllabus, I think you guys are expected to know the water cycle. Am I right? I think you guys are expected to know this, but then I think most of you know this through your geography, right? So I won't touch on this in detail. Right. So I want us to look at the nitrogen cycle, right? So there on your nitrogen cycle is an element which is required to make proteins. So remember when we're talking about your nutrition of plants, we mentioned that nitrogen is used mainly for your growth in plants, right? To make your enzymes as well as to make the amino acids. Are we following? So nitrogen is a very important element in the environment. So neither plants nor animals can absorb it from the air as nitrogen. We cannot use it as nitrogen, meaning we need to be able to convert it into something else for it to be able to be utilized. Are we following? Right. And also because it's very stable, right? So if you remember, your nitrogen has a triple bond. So it's very hard to break this bond. It requires a lot of energy. So it needs to be converted into another product for us to be able to utilize it, right? So it needs a lot of energy to break this triple bond there. Are we following? Which is mentioned there, right? So if you understand that point, we move on to the next slide. However, there are two ways it can be taken out of the air and converted into something easier to absorb, right? So we start with the nitrogen fixing bacteria, right? So these are found in free living in the soil and also in the roots nodules of certain plants such as your peas, beans, clover, which are your leguminous plants. Are we following? Right. So they have what is required to convert your nitrogen and then fix it into your solutions to make the nitrites or your nitrates. Are you following? So they're practically taking it out of the air and into your ions. Right. So your nitrogen gas is then changed into your nitrates or your nitrites. Right. So if you remember, your nitrates are the ones with the O3, and then the nitrites are just the NO or the NO2. Are we following? I hope I'm not
Yes,
moving
sir.
too fast. Right. So that is one way of fixing or converting the nitrogen in air into your ions. And then there's lightning. Lightning can fix nitrogen gas by splitting the bond between the two atoms and turning them into nitrous oxides. So you've got your N2O and your nitrogen dioxide that dissolve in rainwater and leach into the soil. Right? So they in the soil, they're now present as ions. Are we following? So you need to be able to know a lot of chemistry here. Well, since we're looking at elements, so you need to be able to know your chemistry, the basics of your chemistry. Are you following? Right.
Yes, sir.
The plants absorb the nitrates they find in the soil, use the nitrogen in them to make the proteins. Are we following? So the nitrates are what we then use to then absorb them through the roots and then to assimilate them, to get to use them. The plants are able to then go through your, what is it called? The protein synthesis. Right? To create your amino acids, to create the proteins, the enzymes required for them to function. Are we following? Right? And then the animals eat the plants and get the nitrogen they need from the proteins in the plant or animal. Right? So that is one process there. And then you have the waste. The waste from the animal sends nitrogen back into the soil as ammonium compounds. Right? So your ammonium compounds, they have this formula, the NH4+. Those are the ammonium compounds, right? So if you remember, if you looked at deamination, that is also given off in the form of urea. Are we following? Right. So when the animals and plants die, they decay and all the proteins inside them are broken down into ammonium compounds and put back into the soil by decomposers. Right. So that is your process of the nitrogen cycle in a summary, right? You're expected now to know which bacteria, your nitrogen fixation, which process, how does it occur, the denitrifying, the denitrification, the nitrification, how does that occur, right? So we'll look at that as well. The plants can't absorb ammonium compounds though, so a second type of soil bacteria, which is the nitrifying bacteria, is required, right? So that's the one which converts the ammonium compounds to your nitrites. Are we following? So your nitrifying bacteria converts your ammonium compounds to nitrites and then to the nitrates. Are we following? So that is the process of nitrification. And then I think some of the examples that are nitrifying bacteria, I think is the Nitrococcus bacteria. That's an example of your nitrifying bacteria. Right, so they convert the ammonium compounds to nitrates and then to your nitrates. Right, that is your nitrification. And then here they talk about the anaerobic bacteria called the denitrifying bacteria. The denitrifying bacteria, which are found poorly in aerated soil and not much oxygen. So this denitrification, they do the opposite. They convert the nitrates back into nitrogen gas. That's your denitrification. So you're turning your nitrate ions back into nitrites and then back into nitrogen gas. So it is the opposite. Your denitrification, you're turning the nitrates back into nitrogen gas. So it's going back into the atmosphere. Are we following, guys?
Yes, sir.
Are there any questions so far?
No, sir.
Okay, so if there are no questions, we can move on. Right, so here it says the farmers can help reduce the amount of these unhelpful bacteria by plowing and turning over the soil. Right, so that, can you see how human activities can change the environment as well? So you need to also know that how do we affect these nitrogen cycles and the environment as well. Right, so this is the nitrogen cycle. So we can start off at this point, the nitrogen in the atmosphere, right, N2. So with N2, there's two ways of changing it into your nitrate ions. So the first one being the nitrogen fixation by lightning, right? So remember, since it's lightning contains a lot of energy, so it can break that bond. Yes, is there a question?
Can you zoom in?
Oh, zoom in. Okay, let me do that. Is that better? Are you able to see now?
Yes, sir.
All right. So as I was saying, the first step, we can take the nitrogen in the air and fix it into the solution in the soil is through lightning. So lightning has a lot of energy and it can break that bond, the triple bond between your nitrogen atoms, right? So that is the first step, which is your nitrogen fixation by lightning. Then the second way is the nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil and in your legume root nodules. Are we following? So those are two ways nitrogen fixation occurs. So remember nitrogen fixation, you're taking the nitrogen gas and fixing it into the soil, right? Making it present in ions. So it's converted from nitrogen gas to your nitrogen, your nitrate ions or your nitrite ions. Are we following? So that's how we get here to your nitrate ions. So now in the soil, your nitrate ions can then be absorbed into your roots, right there, right? So the absorption of your nitrate by plants by active transport. So remember how we move your ions from the soil into the root themselves. This is done through your active transport, right? And then the plant and then can be assimilated to make your proteins, your enzymes, whatever, right? Depending on the plant, right? So then that also now the nitrate ions can then be taken back into the atmosphere through your denitrification, right? So remember denitrification, changing back your nitrate ions to nitrate and then to nitrogen gas. Yes, and then this is done by your denitrifying bacteria as well. Right, so please take note of that key there at the corner. So this is done by your denitrifying bacteria. Right, and then what do we have? So from there, we can also look at the nitrification. Your nitrification. So once you've produced your amino acids and the protein in your plants, this is then fed on by your animals so that they can also grow, right? They also need the proteins, they also need the amino acids, right? Once they feed on that, they also pass out the excess nitrogen through urea, right? Your deamination, and that is passed out as waste. So the decomposition of your plant or animal proteins by microorganisms then releases the ammonium ions. Are we following? This ammonium ions is then converted to your nitrate ions through nitrification, your nitrifying bacteria. Are we following?
Yes, sir. Sir.
Yes. All right, so if there are no questions, we move on. So that is the nitrogen cycle as a whole. So you're expected to just know how you fix your nitrogen into the soil, what happens to the nitrogen in the soil, what form is it found in, what converts the processes required, so it's nitrogen fixation, your nitrification, your denitrification, your nitrogen assimilation, how is the nitrogen used in that cycle? So you need to know all the processes, where is it used, how is it converted? All right, so please make sure you know all those steps. Right. So if we're done there, there's also another cycle that I thought might be clear for you guys. How we're moving from your nitrogen in the atmosphere. So always try and start from there. Right. So remember nitrogen fixation, either done through your nitrogen fixing bacteria or the lightning. And then once you get there, your nitrogen fixing bacteria can also convert it to ammonia, right? So now from this here, ammonia can also convert it to nitrites and the nitrate. Then the nitrate is absorbed into your roots via active transport. Are you following? So that's when it can now be used. Once it's absorbed into the plants, it can then be used to make your proteins and your amino acids, to make their enzymes. And then once that is done, they also feed, the animals are able to feed on that to absorb their proteins and your amino acids, right? And then if they can't, if there's excess proteins, they are deaminated into urea and then passed out as waste, right? And that's how you get your ammonium ions. The ammonium ions are then nitrified to get the nitrite ions, the nitrate ions. Then the nitrate ions are also broken down or converted to nitrogen gas via denitrification, by the denitrifying bacteria. Are we following? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Right, so if that makes sense, we move on. If there are no questions, please feel free to use the chat if you've got questions. Right, so the other thing that I wanted us to look at was your human influences on the environment, right? So you need to be able to talk about what is population, right? So from there, you can see that population is a group of organisms of one species living in the same area at the same time. That is the definition of population, right? So you need to know that it's a group of organisms of one species living in the same area at the same time. That is the definition of population. Then what is a community? Community are all of the populations of the different species in an ecosystem. Chance is asking me to explain denitrification again. Right, so let me just go back there. Where's denitrification? Yeah. Right, so denitrification, you're changing your nitrate ions back into your nitrogen gas. So it's the opposite of nitrification. Right, so this is done by your denitrifying bacteria. I think it should be an ion, sorry. So this is done by the denitrifying bacteria. So it's just the opposite of your nitrification. So it's as if it's removing the nitrogen in the soil and putting it back into the atmosphere. Does that make sense? All right. I think another point that I forgot to explain is that this cycle, there always needs to be a balance, right? The amount of nitrogen needs to be balanced as well as the amount of nitrogen in the soil, right? You can't have too much nitrogen in the atmosphere. Once you have too much nitrogen in the atmosphere, that can lead to your damage of your environment through your acid rain formation, right? So remember, if you've got too much nitrogen in the atmosphere, it can lead to the formation of your nitric acid, right? Your nitric acid can lead to the breakdown of many environments, such as your limestones and your leaching of other ions in the soil, right? So it changes the acidity in the soil. So you need to be able to show that it's important to maintain the balance of your nitrogen in the atmosphere and the nitrogen in the soil. As well goes for the carbon cycle, right? So we already talked about the implications of maintaining a balance, right? So if that's complete, we move on to the next part, right? So I was explaining the community. When you have a community, you're looking at all of the populations of the different species, how they interact with each other in an ecosystem. Are we following? So you're looking at, for example, if you're looking at your aquatic ecosystem, you're looking at the different types of fishes that you have in the water, right? How they interact with each other, the food webs, the food chain, what is the producer, what is the primary consumer, how they affect each other or how they interact with each other, right? Then an ecosystem, which is defined as a unit containing the community of organisms and the environment interacting together. That is an ecosystem. So it's a unit containing the community of organisms and the environment interacting with each other. That is the ecosystem. So it's important to know these definitions before we start looking at the human influences on the environment. Are we following? So did we all get that?
Yes, sir.
Right. So we move on to the next part. We're now talking about the factors that affect the population growth. Right. So when you're looking at factors that affect population growth, you need to look at the resources, right? All living organisms compete with each other for food, water, and living space. Those are the resources for that particular ecosystem, the food, water, and living space. Those which are the best adapted to the environment are generally increase their populations at the expense of those less well adapted, right? So I think when we're looking at inheritance, we talked about variation as well. Which organism was adapted for that environment, right? So over time, that species can pass down particular genes that make it better suitable or make it suitable to last in that environment that it's living in. So that environment sort of selects for those particular species as well. So we looked at that. I think we'll look at it as well when we're looking at questions on to deal with variation as well with the environment. Right. So you need to be able to know which one is better adapted for the environment they're in and which one is less adapted for the environment. Then we talk about the population growth in most organisms is controlled by the following three factors. So we mentioned it's food supply, right? The resources. There's also predation, right? Which organism is hunted, right? So if you have a lot of, for example, a lot of predators in a particular environment and less of the species being hunted, then that ecosystem is going to fall apart because there's not enough food for the species as well. And that species, once it's wiped out, it becomes extinct as well. So that is an important factor to mention. And then there's disease, right? So if a disease breaks out and a certain species is wiped out by that disease, it affects the ecosystem, right? Looking at a particular food chain, right? So if you lose a certain, let's say a primary consumer, then it affects the rest of the food chain. Since that primary consumer was acting as a food supply for the next feeding level. So those are important factors to look at when we're talking about factors affecting your population growth. Are we following? Right. Then we look at human population growth. Right. So I think most of this you looked at when you were doing geography. Right. So human population growth globally has been increasing exponentially for the last 150 years. Right. So if you look at that graph there, we're given from 8,000 BCE and how it's increased to this millennia. Right. As you can see, there's an exponential growth there. The growth has literally shot up compared to the other years, the other 1,000 years. It's not as much as how it's increasing today. Does it make sense? So human population growth is expanding exponentially. There are many reasons for this exponential growth, including improved technology, right, which is leading to an abundance of food, which is equals to a rapid increase in the birth rate, right? So we've got the resources, right? We've got now the better ways to maintain the food supply, right? We're no longer just at the mercy of the environment. We're able to replicate the conditions for us to get the optimum growth for our crops, right? So that's the improved technology there. And then you have improved medicine, hygiene, and your healthcare, right? So which decreased the death rate. Are we following? So both of those are very important factors to how the human population growth is expanding exponentially. Are we following? So there on the side, we're also given an examples way saying there are many different ways of showing human population growth. In an exam, look carefully at the data to figure out the trend it is showing and think about how that links to social implications, locally and globally, of the growth of the human population, right? So that is very important to know. So always make sure you take account for your x-axis and the y-axis. What is it showing? Try and see the trend in the graph. Always, that's how we look at graphs when we're trying to interpret them. Are we following? Right, so we move on to the next slide. So here, they're telling us the human population growth has been increasing exponentially. So I think it's the same point. This should be the same point as the previous one. Just showing as a bigger picture. Right, so I think this one is more clear than the last one. Right, so we move on to the next part. Now we're looking at the growth curve. Right, so if you remember from a previous lesson, we mentioned this growth curve. How do we monitor a growth of a certain population of a species? Right, so if the growth of microorganisms in a fermenter is measured over time, the population growth looks like the graph below. So this is your growth curve. So the first point that we have is the lag phase. Then the exponential or the log phase, which is the rapid growth. Then the stationary phase where there's no growth of the population, and then the death phase. So those are the 4 phases on the growth curve that you need to know and how it looks like. Right. So there it says the sigmoid population growth curve for population growing in an environment with limited resources. Right. So that is your typical growth curve that you're expected to know. Right. So if they ask you to draw a growth curve, you draw something like that. Right. So now we try and explain what happens at each of those stages, beginning with the lag phase. Right. So the lag phase, the organisms are adapting to the environment before they are able to reproduce. In addition, at this stage, there are very few organisms, and so reproduction is not producing large numbers of offspring. So your lag phase, your organisms are still adapting to their new environment. Are we following? Right. So that is the very important point of the lag phase, the first stage in the growth curve. Right. Then the second stage, the log phase, once they are fully adapted to the environment, it's also known as the exponential phase. Why? Because the food supply is abundant, the birth rate is rapid now, and the death rate is low. Right? There's plenty of resources at this stage. Growth is exponential and only limited by the number of new individuals that can be produced. So reproduction is very high at this stage, since there are plenty of resources. The birth rate is rapid and death rate is low. Are we following? So that is the log phase. Right. So it's also important to note that the organisms are now fully adapted to the environment. Right. And then we move on to the stationary phase, the third stage in the growth curve. The population levels out due to a factor in the environment, right? So remember, there are limited resources. That's what causes the curve to level out like that, which are not being replenished. Birth rate and death rate are equal and will remain so until either the nutrient is replenished or becomes severely limited. Right, so that is the stationary phase. Right, it's the third stage in the growth curve. Then we move on to the death phase. So in the death phase, the population decreases as death rate is now greater than the birth rate. Right, so there are more organisms dying rather than organisms being reproduced or being given birth to. This is usually because food supply is short or metabolic wastes produced by the population have built up to toxic levels. Are we following? So food supply is short, and then your metabolic waste as well are also acting as your toxic waste to the population. So that's what's happening in the death phase. Right. So you've got more organisms passing away and less being given birth to. And then organisms in the natural environment are unlikely to show population growth like the sigmoid growth curve because they are affected by many other factors here, which include the changing temperature or light, your predators, the disease, immigration, as well as emigration. And so those are the factors that affect the sigmoid growth curve, why it doesn't always look like that. Are we following? Are there any questions so far?
Okay, just a comment from my side. If there are no questions, does it mean we understand? Or that we don't hear, we are not behind the screens? Because you know that online teaching really requires a high level of discipline. So just by raise of hands, let's see who can still hear us, who can still be, who is still active, who is still out of the class. Okay, JJ, Chance, Maria. Okay. So if there are no questions, that means we understand it. Okay, great. So I can see the level of discipline, everything is really on point. Keep it up, guys. Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no questions, we can then look at our exam questions. Right, so I just put some questions together so that we can look at what we were discussing in the lesson, as well as your food chains, food webs. I've also included questions on that. Right, so we'll look at those questions as well. So the first question we have here is, which of the following would be a negative feature of monoculture crops on an ecosystem? Which of the following will be a negative feature of monoculture crops on an ecosystem? So you've got your A, your monoculture crops produce more food. B, monoculture crops produce less food. C, the genetic variation of organisms is reduced. Or D, crops harvesting at the same time. And so for this section, you can use the chat to put your answers. Since it's multiple choice, you just put your letter corresponding to, or what you think is the correct answer. Right, so I see your answers. Right, so the answer there should be C. The genetic variation of organisms is reduced. If you only have one crop, that's what mono means. You're only growing one type of crop. So it reduces the genetic variation of organisms in that particular ecosystem. Are we following? Does that make sense? Do you all understand why the answer is C there?
Yes, sir.
No, sir.
Someone said no, right? So monoculture is literally telling you that they're only growing one type of crop. So if you have one type of crop in that ecosystem, it's not all plant species that use that as their source of food. So you're now limiting which species can survive in that ecosystem. Can you see that? So if you're limiting the number of species that can survive in that ecosystem, you've reduced the number of organisms in that system, in that ecosystem. Therefore, the genetic variation decreases since you only have
Thank you, sir.
one type of species. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next question. Which of these describe a reason for conserving plant species? Is it A, to obtain drugs for medicinal use? B, to decrease rainfall? C, to absorb oxygen from the air? Or D, to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? Which of these describe a reason for conserving plant species? Okay, I'm seeing your answers. Mhm. Right, so let's look at the answers now. Right, so for A, we can get drugs for medicinal use from our plants. Right, so from especially your rare plants, we get a lot of good drugs from them. So this one is correct, right? And then we look at B. It says to decrease rainfall. Is that correct? We do
No.
not decrease rainfall, right? By conserving the plant species, we do not decrease rainfall. We actually need more of it. And then C, to absorb oxygen from the air. Do plants absorb oxygen from the air? Or what is they actually do, but then their main purpose, remember, is to absorb the carbon dioxide. Right. So C is also wrong. Then to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that is also wrong. Right. Main purpose, remember, is to absorb the carbon dioxide, and then photosynthesize and release oxygen into the air. Right. So all by elimination, B, C, and D are wrong. The answer is A. Are we following?
Yes, sir.
So we move on to the next question. Which of these two gases both contribute to climate change? Which of these two gases both contribute to climate change? Is it A, oxygen and methane, B, sulfur dioxide and methane, C, carbon dioxide and methane, or D, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide? All right, so if you said C is your answer, that is correct. So those are the two gases that we know that contribute to climate change, your carbon dioxide and the methane gas. Are we following? Oxygen is not a greenhouse gas. Sulfur dioxide is not a greenhouse gas. Are we following? So the answer there is C. Right, move on to the next question. Which of these agricultural practices may cause the most pollution? Is it A, cutting down trees, B, adding fertilizers to the soil, C, digging plant material into the crop, or D, growing high yield crops? Which of these agricultural practices may cause the most pollution? Okay, so if you said your answer is A, that is correct. You're cutting down trees causes the most pollution there, right? You're cutting down of your trees causes the most pollution. That is the one that causes the most pollution there, compared to your adding fertilizers to the soil, as well as digging plant material into the crop. It doesn't really cause a lot of pollution. Are we following? So remember, when you cut down trees, your deforestation, you're removing your plants that can actually absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? And then also when you cut down the trees, they also burn these trees. That also puts or increases the carbon dioxide content in the air. So that is a form of pollution that we have there. Are we following?
Yes, sir.
So your answer should be A. When you cut down trees, you're reducing the number of producers or the number of plants that can absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and change it to or convert it to oxygen. When they also cut it down, they also burn these trees. When they burn the trees, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, therefore increasing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's why it causes the most pollution. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Right, so we'll move on to the next question. Which of these is the cause of the biggest problem for aquatic life globally? Which of these is the cause of the biggest problem for aquatic life globally? Is it A, eutrophication, B, global warming, C, use of herbicides, or D, plastic microbeads? Okay, so if you said A, that is correct, your eutrophication. Right, who can explain to me what eutrophication is? Right, so the answer is eutrophication. Now, who can explain to me what eutrophication is? Any volunteers?
Okay, so eutrophication occurs when fertilizers are washed into like water sources, like maybe lakes or
Yes.
rivers, and then the ammonia or the fertilizer will cause an overgrowth of the surface or the algae, and then this will block out light. This will block out light from entering the plants, like the aquatic plants in the water. And when these plants die because they can't receive light, the decomposers or bacteria will then feed on decaying matter. They'll feed on the decaying matter, and then they'll use the oxygen in the water for respiration. And this can affect other organisms like the aquatic animals, the fish.
That's very correct. Excellent.
Yeah.
So as she said, your fertilizers, when they're washed into the lakes or your water bodies, right? So your algae, your water plants, then use that fertilizer, and then that becomes a problem because they start to overgrow. When they overgrow, they block out the sunlight into the water. So when that happens, your other plants that need that water, that need that light, can no longer photosynthesize as well. So they start to die and they start to decay, right? That increases the carbon dioxide concentration in the water, which is bad for all the plant species in that water ecosystem. That's why most of them begin to die away. Your fish or your different types of water organisms that you have there. Are we following? So that is eutrophication. Thank you, Roster. Right. We move on to the next question. Here we have a graph. It shows the relationship between the number of lichens and the levels of sulfur dioxide pollution. Right. So you can see there from that graph, this is the sulfur dioxide concentration. Right. And then we have the number of lichen species on the y-axis there. Right. So which of these statements best describe the graph? Is it A, sulfur dioxide levels do not affect lichen growth? B, as sulfur dioxide levels increase, the number of lichen decreases? C, lichen cannot survive if there is sulfur dioxide present? Or D, as sulfur dioxide levels increase, so does the number of lichen. So which one is the answer? Sulfur dioxide is a gas. It's a very poisonous gas. That is, if it's present, it can limit it can also poison certain species in the environment. So it's sort of like poisonous gas. So which of these statements best describe the graph? Okay, Chance is asking what is a lichen? It's basically an organism that relies on other organisms to survive. So it's sort of like almost like your algae, right? They need other organisms for them to survive. Sort of like your fungus. So they're basically your organisms that need symbiotic relationships to survive. They depend on other microorganisms or other organisms to survive. Yes, so if you said your answer is B, that is correct. Your answer is B. So as the sulfur dioxide levels increase, the number of lichen decreases. So as you can see, as we increase our sulfur dioxide concentration, your number of lichens decreases. As we're going to the right that way, the number of your lichen species decreases as well. We can't say C is our answer because they're saying lichens cannot survive if there is sulfur dioxide present. At 20, there is sulfur dioxide present, but then we have got number of lichens there present. So your answer cannot be C. Are we following? As well as A, we're saying sulfur dioxide levels do not affect lichen growth. We can clearly see the trend is showing that it does affect. As you increase, the number also decreases. So it does affect that. So A cannot be your answer. Then D, as sulfur dioxide levels increase, so does the number of lichen. That is incorrect, as you can see. If it was increasing and the number of lichen was increasing, your graph will be going that way, not down like that. Are we following? So
Yes,
your
sir.
answer is B. Right. So we'll move on to the next question. Right. So this one, it says the image below shows the results of a study on the types of animals found
Okay.
along a stretch of stream near to a factory. Right. So you can see the species of animals, the types of animals. So at the factory, you've got your mayfly nymph and the stonefly nymph. The factory emptying pollutants into the environment, right? At that stage there. And then you've got the direction of the flow. It's going from the factory down the stream there. So you've got your rat-tailed maggot sludge worm and the bloodworm at this stage. Then the bloodworm leech and the water loose snail. Then the shrimp, caddis fly larvae, as well as the mayfly nymph and the stonefly nymph there. Right, so what is the question? Which animal will live in the most polluted water? Which animal will live in the most polluted water? So we go there. Which one can we see would survive in the most polluted water? So is it a shrimp? Is it B, sludge worm? Is it C, a leech? Or is it D, a snail? So is it A, is it B, is it C, or is it D? Yeah, so that's correct. So see, most of you are getting that correct. Your answer is B, the sludge one. Right. So that is correct. If you route B, the answer is B. Right. So we move on to the next question. Right. So the levels of this dissolved oxygen were measured in a river. The results were plotted on a graph. This is shown below. At which point does raw sewage enter the river? At which point does a raw sewage enter the river? So if you can notice, it's showing us from the key, the one that is the spaces, the dashes, is the dissolved oxygen, and then the dots is the mineral ions. So at which point does the raw sewage enter the river? Is it at A, is it at B, is it at C, or is it at D? So look at the graph carefully. So you're showing us the levels of the dissolved oxygen and the mineral ions. And then A, B, C, D is distance along the river. Right. So you're asking at which point does the raw sewage enter the river? Right, so let's look at the question together. Let's look at the question together. So remember, they're asking us at which point does raw sewage enter the river? So remember, when you're releasing your pollutants, your raw sewage into the river, what's happening? What is happening? If you have raw sewage entering a river, you're having your deposits, your, what are they called? Your chemicals entering the river. So you can include your fertilizers, anything that decreases the oxygen level, right? So the point that it enters, you're going to have your decreased oxygen levels as well as an increase in mineral ions. So at the point where you have a decrease in the dissolved oxygen and an increase in your mineral ions, that is the point where you have there'll be sewage entering. Are we following? So at this
Yes,
point,
sir.
we've got A, what are we seeing? We've got high levels of your dissolved oxygen, and then low levels of mineral ions. Are we following? But then as you can see, as it starts to decrease, we're getting a decrease in the dissolved oxygen and the mineral ions. At point B, the dissolved oxygen is already decreasing. Are we following? Does that make sense? At point B,
Yes.
your dissolved oxygen, they're saying it's at the same level. It is at the same level. At C, what's happening? We have high mineral ions and low oxygen levels, dissolved oxygen. Right? So these are the conditions when you have your sewage entered in the river. These are the conditions that we're talking about. So where did it enter? Is it B or is it C? Your answer should be C. Are we following? Your answer should be C. That is where you have the highest levels of your mineral ions and your dissolved oxygen. Are we following?
Yes, sir.
Right. We move on to the next question. Which of the following is the correct definition for a suitable resource? A resource that can be replaced. A. B. The resource that is running out. C. Making sure that needs are met for future generations. D. A resource that can be replenished as quickly as it is used up. Which one is the correct definition for a suitable or sustainable resource? Right, so the answer for this one is D. The answer is D, a resource that can be replenished as quickly as it is used up. That is your sustainable resource. Are we following? So when you say A, when you say it is replaced, one is making noise. Thank you. Right. So A is wrong because when you're saying is it replaced, what do you mean by that? It can be replaced by another type of resource. Are we following? So that does not make it sustainable. It means that there are alternative forms of that same resource. So your answer A is wrong. So the only one that we have there should be D, a resource that can be replenished as quickly as it is used up. That is your sustainable resource. Are we following? Right, so I think our lesson is about to end. So let's quickly go through the last question. This diagram shows how wastewater sewage can be treated. So you're starting with the filter and then the sedimentation tank. The sludge is then taken to the sludge digester, and then also as you remove the sludge, aerate the water, and then the second sedimentation takes place, and then you release it into the river. So that is your process of your filtration of the water or cleaning of the water, right? Why is air pumped in the aeration tank? Is it A, to sediment the sludge, B, to encourage the rapid growth of microorganisms, C, to stop the growth of microorganisms, or D, to float the sludge to the surface? What is your answer for that one? Is it A, B, C, or D? Right. So for this one, the answer is B. Is to encourage the rapid growth of your microorganisms. Right. So the reason being, when you have the sludge at this point here, you've removed your inorganic material at this point, at this sedimentation tank, right? You filtered out the inorganic materials. So what is left off is the organic materials, right? So when you aerate, you are providing oxygen to your microorganisms so that they can decompose the organic material, right? Since the microorganisms present, the aerating then will provide them with oxygen or the for the respiration to take place so that they can decompose the sludge. Are we following? Therefore, removing that organic material or turning it into other waste that can be removed in the second sedimentation tank. That is the reason for your aeration. So you're providing or encouraging the rapid growth of your microorganisms so that they can decompose the organic material. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
All right. So that is the last question. I think our lesson has come to an end. It's already 1:05. So if you guys have no questions, I think that is the end of the lesson. We'll be sharing a worksheet for, just hold on.
Yeah, just a short announcement from my side. I have set in the lesson now more on the admin side of things. And as I always tell you, that online teaching is not the same as face-to-face. It will never replace that. It is just to complement it. And the reason why we did it like this today is, we were all on weekend, long weekend, taking off the big days and the festive season. So we came back a little bit late from the farm. So to put all logistics in place for the face-to-face could not be done in time, but we will still resume with the face-to-face tomorrow. I don't want you to leave the meeting. I know there are 2 people that already left the meeting. So the rest of you, please stay in the meeting. There's another one that left the meeting now. The announcement that I wanted to make was just the worksheet that we'll be sharing. Plus, I've only counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. Maybe Rishitwa and her brother, I can count as 2. So 7 people that have been actively involved, especially on the questions, putting in the chat box, or they're responding to that or asking questions. That makes me think what the rest of us are doing, because we are about 25 in this lesson, 25 participants. So we would like you to engage. The reason why we put the multiple choice questions here is so that that engagement can be much easier than for us to discuss a structured question, but we then share the worksheet on the structured questions. And again, we want you to take full responsibility. The first step that you are responsible is that you're in the class. That's very good. But not just to connect, put your device down, and then, you're doing whatever you're doing at home, but to be actively involved. Therefore, please, I will also put this on the group for the parents, because I cannot understand how out of 25 learners, only 7 learners are taking part in the questions, or even asking questions or responding to questions. It doesn't make sense. So please, guys, take it seriously. The exams are just around the corner. But with that said, please just look at the following. I'll quickly share the screen. What Mr. Samba has been sharing with you was basically on this topic, on topic 5 here, which is the relationship of organisms with one another and their environment. This is the very last topic in your biology syllabus. So we try to work backwards. So he has discussed most of these points that we have over here, and that will now be consolidated with the worksheet that you will be, I already sent it on the WhatsApp group so that you can do it. We will not police you on the worksheet to say, please have it in or whatsoever. I know Louise will definitely finish it and she will send it for marking. So we want that type of attitude. You should be go-getters. Get out there and you do it yourself. You come to us and you exhaust these resources that we are offering. So please, guys, just take a look at it. So let me just show you just a glimpse of it. So again, these are the exam type questions on your ecosystems or your relationship. So please go through it. It's not a lot of questions. Look at this question, for example. Define the term population, right? You have done this right now with Mr. Samba. There was a whole slide on that, and also some reasons that can decline the population size. You've also looked at this. So this is the practicality of it. So if you don't do it yourself and apply and then bring it back to us so that we can guide you to say, okay, this is right, this is not right, then how are we supposed to help? Are we together, guys? So please answer them. Some of you can even answer this with a digital pen, write it down. You can send it to us personally, to me or to Mr. Samba, and then we can guide you accordingly, okay? So please look at that, or you can answer on a piece of paper, take a picture, and you send it back to us, okay? So please go through that, and we wish you all the best. We will have our maths lesson starting in the next 20 minutes or so, okay? We can give you the extra 5-6 minutes. So let's say 20 minutes to 6, that's when the maths lesson will start. The link is already on the group, so you can just simply click on the link. So have a blessed day. Bye.
Bye, sir.
So
Bye, sir.
Bye, sir.
All right.
Bye.